Hello everyone, welcome back to another bit of APUSH. Today we'll be looking at Key Concept 4.1.2, continuing with this new historical period 4, where we're getting into the development of the second party system. Last time we looked at politics of this era, going all the way back from about the year 1800 up through about the year 1840. What we're focusing on this time is how, because of these political changes, there were corresponding social changes as well, and developing a more distinct American culture, a national identity, because we are now a new country and gone through a few years of development, and we start to become our own thing. Alright, so first thing we're going to look at is how beliefs during this era are shifting more to the focus on the individual. Focusing on reasoning and more popular participation, and this also leads into a new rebirth of religious fervor in the Americas. We had the first Great Awakening back a few years, about a decade before the American Revolution. We will now get into the second Great Awakening here. Alright, so first thing to talk about has to do with the rise of democracy and how voting requirements were changing. So, we saw this happen with Andrew Jackson. By the time Jackson is running to be president, most voting restrictions on property ownership had been gotten rid of across all the states. So what that means is now the populace that can vote are white males. So women still can't vote, even free blacks still can't vote, but that property qualification is gone. And that means that more people participate in democracy. If you look at that chart to the right, it shows you how much of the people who could vote were voting. And as we go from 1824 to 1844, you can see that we go from about 25% participation all the way to over 75% participation of those who could vote were voting. And that means people felt like they were more involved in the running of their country, the choice of their representatives, and that meant that democracy is developing in a way because of that. Now, there are more representatives in Congress and throughout the country because the West is developing. People who wanted to get land, who wanted to sort of get ahead when there weren't opportunities on the East Coast anymore, were moving west, and those with lots of ambition were running for office and getting elected. People like even Henry Clay were ones from places like Kentucky that are further west, and because they became states later, because people went there later, there were these chances for involvement in government through that. Another thing that had to do with these individualistic beliefs had to do with the First Amendment to the Constitution. So the First Amendment has various aspects to it, so freedom of speech, freedom to petition the government, freedom of assembly, oh god, I'm on the spot here, freedom of the press. The one we're focusing on here just for this has to do with religion. So the First Amendment guarantees that there can be no religion, sort of national religion, in the way that England had the Church of England. Right? There can be no United States religion. There's freedom of practice. The government cannot prevent you from doing that. And also later on, it bans religious tests. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be, filling in a Scantron to see what religion you are. It's just saying that religion can't be held as a basis for whether or not you're eligible to hold jobs within the government. So, what this meant is there was room for religious plurality, or room for different denominations. What does that lead to? A second Great Awakening. Much like the first Great Awakening, there was an emotional appeal and a focus on spreading religion and converting people. The way that it happens this time instead are things called camp meetings, and those are on the picture on the bottom right there. What this had to do with was, especially in these states that were further to the west or had more people migrating there, examples Kentucky and upstate New York, there would be traveling preachers. The towns would announce that they would be having this revival. So if you were interested in going, show up to this big empty field on the appropriate day. They'd have many preachers trying to get people to convert, to be born again, and to revive religion. Now, what develops here is a lot of new Protestant denominations. So it wasn't just one group of people saying, we just want to follow this one ideas and traveling everywhere. They were all over the place, such to an extent that upstate New York was called the burned over district, because it seemed like all these new religious denominations kept on flooding through the area, that people were kind of like burnt out on religion. What are some new denominations? Methodists, Baptists, Unitarians. We'll talk about some other ones in just a second. Something about the Second Great Awakening, it rejected Calvinist and Puritan ideas. So no more predestination. No more idea that whatever you do, you're going to heaven or you're going to hell. You just don't know which it is yet. The idea was now that through good works, you could work your way up to going to heaven. And that was this idea of being born again. You could do all sorts of horrible things in your past, but if you convert, your sins are washed away and you can lead a new life. Okay, now part of the Second Great Awakening was something called American exceptionalism. Now, we're developing this new national culture where people feel like America is different from Europe, but still tied to past European ideas. So Americans felt like they were special, that this country was special. We were the first country to throw off a monarchy, develop a republic in this way, create a constitution, and be spreading out over the continent. People are saying, our country is different, so we are kind of like the promised land. There were many people who thought that actually, what's it called? Like the book of Revelations in the Bible, the idea of sort of the return of Jesus, that it was coming soon because America developed as a country. Okay? Politics and society are developing in this way that where Americans felt we were very special and we were unique. One group within the Second Great Awakening, they're kind of outliers, are the Shakers. They were founded by a woman, which shows you that women are now going to be involved in these religious movements more. They advocated celibacy, so no sex, no marriage, and equal rights for women. Now the difference about the Shakers is you had to join them willingly. If you were married and you had a kid, that kid could not be a member of the Shakers' religion. They had to wait until they were older to be baptized and to join the church. It was kind of this idea of individual belief, and if a kid is just raised with the ideas, they're not choosing it themselves, they're just going along with it. The Shakers said, no, you have to wait till you're an adult, and then you could join. Another one of these communities that falls into that utopian idea that's in the descriptor to the left was the Oneida Community. So they're in New York. Oneida is still a brand of silverware and plates today. That's how this community made all their money. But their community isn't around anymore, the company is. They promoted free love, so having open relationships within their own community. They had this utopian vision of living away from society, but their ideas were different. They were sort of individualistic, and that's what's represented by the Second Great Awakening. There was room for different ideas. Another group that falls into this are the Mormons. We're going to talk about them later because they fit into a different category, better for all these key concepts. All right, so a new national culture emerged that combined European elements, American elements, and regional ideas as well. So let's look at what's going on. So we are developing a more unique culture that is uniquely American. We used to be English colonies, so we have these English traditions. Now we're, getting into our first few decades as a country. We are developing our own traditions. So there's a shift from valuing English common law to valuing our Constitution and holding that sacred. You can see this very day, people always uphold our Constitution made back in 1787 as a basis for why their opinions are correct. We thought we were special. We're the first republic to declare independence from a monarchy. That's that same idea of American exceptionalism that I mentioned before. Other things that are making us unique, a nation of immigrants. So we get a lot of immigration in this era because there is land to move into in the West. So regional identities often pick up on your immigrant traditions, and many immigrants would migrate to the same areas and have communities of their ethnicity and their old nationalities as well. Also, we are expanding westward. Those living out on the frontier had this sense of ruggedness, that they were living in this new modern country, but they were roughing it out on the edges of civilization. Okay? So what this shows is America is distinct or different, and that leads straight into that exceptional idea I keep on mentioning. We develop an American identity. We have elements of other cultures, but we're something uniquely our own. This is a phrase I learned back in high school. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You can bring in English traditions, immigrant traditions, our Constitution, all these new religious denominations from the Second Great Awakening. But when you put it all together, it's something even better. And that's that idea of American exceptionalism, that we are special, we are different. All right? Other things going on, these American creations, part of our identity, are created and codified. A couple examples, Noah Webster standardized the American English language. So to this very day, Americans, we have different spellings than British English or even Canadian English and spellings. That's because of Noah Webster. He created an American dictionary that, dropped the U from some words. So we can, of course, read British English, but we're like, hey, we don't have that letter there. That's where this comes from. Before this, there was no standard for how things should be spelled. People misspelled things all the time. You look at George Washington's letters, he misspelled things all over the place. But this starts to put into place a more standard English for America. We also start to develop literature, art, and religion. Those become distinctly American as well. And I think I bring those up at a later time, so we'll save those for later. All right. Liberal social ideas from abroad and romantic beliefs influenced our new culture. All right, so what we're mainly talking about here is Transcendentalism. This was something that was developing specifically in America, and it was the idea that people could become closer to God by bettering oneself through their individual actions, self-improvement through individual introspection. So it wasn't the idea that you had to go to church every Sunday, that you had to conform to what the church told you to do. It was the idea that if you thought for yourself and acted morally as an individual through what you thought was right, you could get closer to God and become more perfect. Okay? You're kind of transcending this earthly realm to get to the ideas that represent the essence and meaning of life rather than what it means just to be here. Let's look at a few of the main figures from this movement. The originator was Ralph Waldo Emerson. That's the guy on the upper right. So he's viewed as the leader of the movement, and his main work was called Self-Reliance. So just look at the title of that. Self-Reliance, and I said Transcendentalism had a lot to do with individuality. If you rely on yourself, you're acting as an individual. Okay? He's advocating these ideas and then influences others. I'm sure you're going to read these in your English class, these authors at some point. Someone who was influenced by Emerson was a guy named Henry David Thoreau. And what he did is he kind of built on the transcendental idea, saying solitude, being alone, was that time for introspection. So what he actually did is he moved into the middle of the woods, a place called Walden Pond in Massachusetts, and lived there in this tiny cabin by this lake, and just reflected on life. That's, if you've heard of the book Walden, not Mr. Walden, but Walden, it's all about those ideas. He has, these thoughts on, what's going on with the ant that he saw in his house. And he finds ways to bring that into what is the meaning of life. If you're alone and you're sort of separating yourself from all the problems of the world, then you can focus on what it means to be a person. You have to get away from society in order to think about this stuff. Another major work of his was called Civil Disobedience. It's a famous essay on how the individual should oppose laws they are morally opposed to. Now, what was going on with him is he didn't want to pay his taxes because we were going to war, the Mexican-American War that we'll study later on, and he thought it was immoral. So he said, I disagree with this morally. I'm not going to pay my taxes. So he went to jail for tax evasion. But here's what he said. He's like, I'm okay going to jail. I know I'm breaking the law, but I'm not being violent about it. I just disagree with this law, and I have to be willing to accept the consequences. Here's a good quotation from that. He said, under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. So he said, yeah, I'm in jail for doing this, but I disagree with the law, and I can't get away from my personal beliefs. All right, so he was kind of a weirdo. But he was very influential in these ideas. This idea of civil disobedience is going to have an influence on people in later history, like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Right, so what's going on with art, because that's mentioned to the left? We get a bit of a renaissance in art, poetry, and literature. So a couple examples. The best example of changes in poetry was Walt Whitman. So he's working more in the mid-1800s. His most famous work is Leaves of Grass. It's a collection of poems that was published all around the world because people said these ideas that he has in his poetry represent America. And people were very fascinated by us because we thought we were different, and other countries and people thought we were different as well. Now, one poem he has within this collection is called Song of Myself. I've got actually a quotation from it on the wall in class that you probably never noticed. I'll read it in class, and it'll show you how he had these transcendental ideas of don't worry about what's going on here on earth, worry about what's going on in your mind, and filter your experiences through yourself to make up your mind. So very individual thoughts. All right. Writing at the time was what we call Romanticism, inspired by British Romanticism. I'm going to leave this mostly to your English teachers to cover. Here's a couple things. We see it happening in art with the Hudson River School. So if you look to the right, that's an example of what this style of art looked like. It's sort of kind of epic and beautiful in a way. It was showcasing the natural beauty of the American frontier. But it's also romantic. It's idealizing what that looked like. It's not showing, the conflicts between the white settlers and the Indians or all the bad stuff that was going on too. It's romantic. Okay, major writers that were romantic: Washington Irving, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville. Again, I'll leave this up to your English teacher. Just know that they're building on a sense of American identity, but British Romanticism as a style of their writing. All right. Here is our last slide. This one is touching in on what's going on in the lives of African Americans at the time and how they're trying to sort of almost transcend what's going on in their lives as well. Of course, what's going on in their lives is subjugation, slavery, and discrimination. What are they trying to do to make their lives better from within? Okay, one thing that we have to recognize about African American communities at the time is this concept of syncretism, which I'm pretty sure I've mentioned before when we studied the Atlantic slave trade in a previous historical period. So what happened is, as many slaves were forced to come here to America and work together on plantations, they eventually learned about each other's cultures and traditions and adapted and used them to create something that's distinctly an African American culture instead of just an African or an American culture. So what we're seeing now is this starts to spread to religion a little bit. So the Second Great Awakening, let me fast forward a little bit. The Second Great Awakening, remember, said that it promoted individual ideas in religion and how if you do good works here on earth, you can get to heaven. Now, this was very sort of appealing to both slaves and free African Americans. They're saying life sucks for us, okay? They're enslaved or subjugated. But with these ideas, they said, if we believe in Christianity and we follow these tenets of doing good things in life, things are bad here, but they'll be better in heaven, okay? So it inspired kind of liberation-based churches. They read into bits of the Bible, like Exodus, Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. They rejected original sin. Think of that part this way. Original sin says you are born with sin as a human being. That makes it seem like, you are unequal and you are tainted from the very beginning. African Americans didn't like that idea because they're already in this position where they're forced to feel inferior. Being told their inferiority is natural just kind of added insult to injury. So they rejected that. Now, what did African American communities look like with this? Marriage and family relationships were a little bit different. So marriages between slaves and African Americans weren't always binding in a legal sense, because what would happen on a plantation if the wife was sold to a different plantation or their children were sold, the families would be broken up, and then was the abandoned spouse supposed to never remarry, never have children again, never have a family? Basically, the needs of the community outweighed the individual at the time, and you'll see that in a lot of cases within African American life, or I should say slave life on plantations, of they had to adapt their situation to make the best of it because it was horrible. There was really no way around it. There was a free black population in America at the time, but still widespread discrimination, and it's maybe the first time I'll say this, but I'll be saying it a lot. This type of discrimination was in the South, and it was in the North too, okay? Just because we're getting to this separation of there being abolitionists and people against slavery in the North doesn't mean these people against slavery wanted black people to even be around. They just thought slavery was immoral and thought the system should be gone. Okay, so examples of this discrimination: lower paying jobs, segregation, no voting rights, no trial by jury. Really, they weren't guaranteed any constitutional rights like white people were. They also faced the danger of being kidnapped and then being sold into slavery. Because they lacked these civil rights or civil liberties, they had no way of proving that they weren't a slave. Remember, the color line was used with African slavery specifically so that it was easier to identify slaves because of skin color. Now, this would be a problem for some people in the North. I'll talk about it when we get closer to the Civil War again. Now, with sort of free African American communities being developed, and with the North moving away from any need for slavery, we see the development of early abolitionism. Abolitionism is the idea of abolishing slavery. Okay, here's one of the early organizations to respond and sort of develop there. It's called the American Colonization Society, and sure, it sounds great they want to get rid of slavery, but their idea was this back to Africa movement. That means they said, let's get rid of slavery, but send all people of African descent back to Africa. Now, these were people who had never been to Africa, generations separated from the language, the culture, everything. They did not want to go back to Africa overwhelmingly. They said, no, we're American. We just want rights. We just want to be protected and enjoy the opportunities that white people have in this country. But at the same time, whites were trying to send them back to Africa. There are some minor examples of some free black people being sent back. That's how the country of Liberia got created. The capital is Monrovia because James Monroe was the president when they were sent there. And it wasn't a widespread thing. It didn't develop as an actual movement, so to speak. But every time this idea of abolitionism comes up, it's an aspect of it. Of many whites who disagree with slavery are saying, well, what are we supposed to do with all these black people that we don't want living next to us or going to school with our kids? They wanted segregation, okay? They thought they could get rid of it by, removing black people. So don't think that abolitionism is like anti-racism. Racism was widespread at the time. All right, as always, thank you for watching. You know your next steps. You know to keep up with them. And see you next time.